I thought I was just observing her, until she noticed me. One question stopped my thoughts, unraveled my composure, and changed everything I thought I knew about trust, curiosity, and connection between worlds. The human had never considered himself particularly observant, at least not in any extraordinary sense. Yet, here he was, standing in the central corridor of the research vessel ES Horizon, trying desperately not to make it obvious that every step he took, every adjustment of his wrist console, was dictated entirely by her presence. She moved through the ship with a grace that seemed almost designed to defy gravity itself, her long ears brushing against her silver-blonde hair as she leaned over a console or inspected the faintly glowing panels along the walls. He told himself it was purely professional interest. Someone had to monitor her actions after all. But the truth sat like a tiny, buzzing drone in his chest. He was captivated endlessly, incomprehensibly. Floating past a section of the observation deck, he noticed her pause before a viewport. The gas giant outside spilled its turquoise brilliance across the glass, casting wavering patterns on her pale, luminous skin. She tilted her head, those piercing ice-blue eyes catching his from across the room, and he almost dropped his datapad in panic. The thought struck him. Perhaps he had been too obvious. Perhaps she had noticed all along. He muttered under his breath about quantum sensor calibration, and tried to look busy, though his hand trembled faintly as he adjusted the hollow display floating before him. He had first seen her the moment the ES Horizon docked at the orbital research station. The crew had given cursory briefings. Her species was known as the Lysari, a rare group of humanoid aliens renowned for their acute perceptual abilities and subtle control over electromagnetic fields. In theory, she should have been intimidating, her presence commanding in a way that made the ship's atmosphere feel charged. But she had arrived with a small, teasing smile, one that immediately undercut any authority she might have exerted. And apparently, authority was not something he needed to be concerned with when his own thoughts had a habit of betraying him. He tried to convince himself that humor could be a shield, and so he muttered jokes about the ship's awkward zero-gravity etiquette whenever she passed, pretending to correct the orientation of floating tools. On one occasion, he had attempted to balance a container of synth protein gel midair, waving it like a baton and declaring, "See, human ingenuity in zero-G, highly advanced." She had laughed, a sound like wind chimes caught in a gentle breeze, and flicked her long fingers at the container, sending it spinning harmlessly across the deck. His cheeks had burned, but she had only smiled wider, tilting her head as if considering whether he had intended to make a fool of himself, or if he had unintentionally succeeded. The first major confrontation occurred when he was checking reactor diagnostics in the aft module. She had appeared behind him, quiet as a whisper in the recycled air, leaning over the edge of the console. Her presence was magnetic. He could feel it in the way the small motes of artificial dust suspended in the light seemed to shift toward her. He turned too quickly, nearly tripping over a floating toolkit, and she raised an elegant brow. "Always watching me. Why, human?" Her voice was calm, deliberate, and threaded with amusement, yet there was an underlying weight to it, as if she were asking not for a trivial explanation but for a truth he had never voiced even to himself. He choked on a laugh, trying to mask the sudden panic with humor. A protocol dictates careful observation of advanced life forms, especially when they have, unique cranial appendages," he stammered, gesturing vaguely toward her long, tapering ears. She blinked slowly, eyes narrowing in amusement. "Cranial appendages," she repeated, her tone perfectly neutral, though a trace of curiosity laced her words. "Is that your attempt at humor, or are humans genuinely incapable of simple honesty?" He swallowed, fumbling to find footing both literal and metaphorical. "Maybe both. Sometimes humor is easier than admitting observation can be personal." He had hoped the words sounded confident, not ridiculous. She smiled, that faint, teasing curl of her lips that seemed impossible for a human face to replicate, and leaned closer, her hair brushing his shoulder. "Well," she said, "if you are going to observe, you might at least try to do it with skill. I can sense the patterns of your thoughts almost as easily as you sense mine." He laughed, a little nervously, and gestured to the floating toolkit. "Skill is still in beta testing. Gravity refuses to cooperate, and I keep getting distracted." She chuckled, her voice carrying through the narrow module like a soft melody, and he felt the tension in his chest loosen slightly, though he suspected he would never truly escape it entirely. Over the next several days, he discovered that the Lysari had an almost absurdly accurate sense of timing. She would appear in the most inconvenient places, or at the precise moment he thought he was alone, catching him mid-thought, mid-laugh, or mid-spill. Once, he had been floating a small container of nutrient gel toward the storage bay when she appeared on the opposite side of the corridor. With a tilt of her head and a flick of her fingers, she redirected the container so that it spun perfectly in a zero-G arc around him before landing safely in the bay. "Your coordination is charmingly flawed," she commented, voice lightly teasing. He groaned, muttering about how zero-G physics was cruelly ironic, and she laughed again, long and unrestrained. Despite the teasing and minor humiliations, a subtle camaraderie began to form. They shared meals in the mess hall, which was little more than a cluster of tethered seats and floating trays, exchanging jokes about the quirks of human and Lysari nutrition alike. He discovered that Lysari diets were a mixture of mineral pastes, protein gels, and occasional raw flora from hydroponic pods, and she discovered that humans had an alarming tendency to burn everything edible unless carefully monitored. One evening, as he fumbled with a floating tray of synth protein squares, she had tilted her head, eyes glinting with amusement, and said, "Humans are fragile in ways both predictable and inexplicable." He had laughed, nearly spilling the tray, and replied, "I prefer to think of it as charmingly vulnerable." She had chuckled, a sound like glass bells, and the exchange had felt impossibly warm. The turning point came when they were sent to investigate a minor electromagnetic anomaly near the station's docking bay. He had been nervously analyzing the fluctuating readings when she appeared at his side, leaning over the console with a casual grace that made him forget entirely about the sensors. "Why do you watch me so intently?" she asked again, voice soft this time, more probing than teasing. He swallowed, fumbling with words. I think I just notice things," he said finally, shrugging awkwardly. "Patterns, behaviors, subtle movements. It's part of the job, but also, sometimes it's hard to stop noticing you." He regretted the confession immediately, imagining it sounded like babbling, yet she only studied him quietly, her long ears twitching slightly, her expression unreadable. Then she laughed, a light teasing sound that echoed through the narrow corridor. "Notice me, human. You make it sound like a cosmic burden. I find it flattering." He blinked, caught between relief and embarrassment, and muttered something about human awkwardness being a defensive mechanism. She raised an elegant brow, her amusement unrestrained, and teased him about humans being unintentionally entertaining. Later, in the ship's small zero-G training module, they engaged in what was part exercise, part playful competition. He attempted to navigate the course while she floated alongside, occasionally giving subtle electromagnetic nudges that threw him off balance. He spun through the course with a mixture of panic and laughter, narrowly avoiding a collision with the padded walls, and she glided alongside effortlessly, her movements precise and elegant. "You are predictably clumsy, human," she said, laughing as he executed a poorly timed somersault, yet somehow charming in the effort. He laughed harder, the tension of being constantly observed and judged dissipating into the absurdity of the moment. By the end of the week, he realized that the game of observation had shifted. He no longer watched her merely out of curiosity. He watched because he wanted to understand her, because the way she interacted with the world revealed something he could not quantify or categorize. and she in turn had begun to reveal small, subtle details of herself, gestures, preferences, quirks, through humor, through teasing, through quiet questions that demanded honest answers. They were engaged in a delicate dance of perception and revelation, orbiting each other in ways neither fully understood, yet both found exhilarating. That night, as the artificial sun dimmed in their orbital greenhouse, he floated beside her, listening to the faint hum of the life support systems and watching the hydroponic flora sway lazily in suspended pots. He dared to joke about human rituals being absurdly complicated compared to Lysari practices, and she countered with a laugh, commenting that the Lysari were not immune to their own peculiarities. He stumbled on a floating watering tool, and she caught it effortlessly, her long fingers brushing his shoulder, and said softly, "It is rare to find humor in the midst of observation." He nodded, heart-thumping, and replied with a smile, "Perhaps. It is rarer still to find someone worth noticing." She regarded him with those ice-blue eyes, and for a fleeting moment the ship, the station, and the distant stars faded into the background, leaving only the two of them suspended in their orbit of words, laughter, and quiet, mutual curiosity. He woke to the soft hum of the ship's life support system, the kind of subtle vibration that made it feel as though the vessel itself were breathing, and immediately realized that someone was already awake before him. Floating near the observation deck, the Lysari woman was adjusting a hollow projection of a nearby asteroid cluster, her long ears swaying with delicate precision as she manipulated the interface with a flick of her slender fingers. Her silver-blonde hair caught the glow of the artificial sun, forming a halo of faint luminescence that made him momentarily forget how to function in zero gravity. He coughed lightly, trying to sound casual, though the sound echoed absurdly in the otherwise silent module. "You're early," he said, floating closer while attempting to maintain the dignity of a human in full zero-G navigation. "Or unusually punctual for a species that doesn't even need sleep like we do." She glanced at him over her shoulder, ice-blue eyes glinting with amusement, and said softly, "Sleep is optional, observation is not." He laughed, nervously dodging a floating maintenance toolkit that she had somehow nudged midair. "Point taken. Humans, however, require coffee, or caffeine analogs, whichever happens to be floating nearby." She tilted her head, the faintest curve of a smile forming on her lips, and floated toward him with the elegance of a leaf drifting through microgravity. "Your fascination with mundane rituals is curious." He shuffled, pretending to adjust his wrist console while attempting not to notice that she had effortlessly closed the distance between them. "Mundane rituals are survival strategies," he said, grinning, "and occasionally provide comic relief when gravity conspires against us." She chuckled, a light, airy sound that seemed to vibrate through the metal corridor, and he felt his chest tighten slightly with the ease of being caught between amusement and awe. Later, they were tasked with recalibrating the ship's external sensors, which had been detecting intermittent fluctuations from a nearby quantum anomaly. He hovered over a cluster of delicate sensor modules, muttering calculations under his breath, while she observed quietly, occasionally offering a teasing comment about human inefficiency. At one point, a floating calibration probe spun wildly out of his grasp, and she deftly intercepted it midair, flicking it back into position as if it were nothing more than a toy. "Predictable," she said, her tone playful, yet entertaining to watch. He laughed, admitting that in zero-G, competence often required improvisation, a statement she countered with a grin that suggested she was both judging and secretly approving of his chaotic skill. The day passed in a mixture of technical work and subtle observation. He found himself increasingly conscious of her presence even when she was not actively engaged with him. In the corridors, he practiced casual glances, careful not to stare too obviously, though he often failed spectacularly. Once, during a routine docking check, he collided mid-step with a tethered maintenance arm, sending a tray of magnetic tools spinning into orbit. She appeared behind him in a whisper, long ears brushing against her shoulders, and simply said, "Gravity is your enemy, yet you persist with determination. Admirable or foolish, I cannot decide." He laughed, feigning a bow, and she laughed with him, their voices mingling in the narrow space like delicate chimes. That evening, they convened in the ship's greenhouse, a suspended maze of hydroponic plants bathed in the soft artificial light of the orbiting sun. He struggled with the zero-G watering mechanism, cursing quietly when a floating reservoir tipped and sent a cascade of nutrient solution spiraling past his shoulder. She appeared beside him, eyes glinting with amusement, and flicked her hand, sending the spill back into the reservoir with perfect control. "Your inefficiency is impressive," she said, lips curling in a playful grin. He bowed, floating backward slightly to avoid brushing against her, and said, "It's part of my charm. Chaos management is an underappreciated human skill." She laughed, tilting her head, and for a brief moment the boundaries between observation and companionship blurred, leaving only the shared absurdity of their coordinated incompetence and skill. As days passed, the teasing evolved into something more intricate. They began to play a subtle game of insight and deflection, where each word, gesture, and glint of the eyes became a message layered with meaning. He would make an exaggeratedly clumsy maneuver, pretending to miscalculate gravitational vectors, while she would respond with a slight nudge of electromagnetic energy that sent him spinning into the ceiling panel, laughter echoing in zero-G as he protested. Then she would comment casually on human vulnerability, which he countered with self-deprecating humor about human fragility and the ineffable charm of species-specific quirks. Their exchanges became a dance, a careful orbit of words and actions that neither fully controlled, yet both participated in willingly. The first serious moment of reflection came when they were examining a cluster of nanite swarm anomalies in a containment field. He had been calculating theoretical interaction patterns when she floated beside him, her long ears brushing his shoulder, and asked softly, "Do you always watch so intently?" He froze, turning toward her with a nervous laugh. I try to observe patterns. It's part of the analysis protocol." She leaned closer, tilting her head, eyes narrowing in both amusement and curiosity. "Or part of something else?" He flushed, fumbling with the control panel. "Perhaps both," he admitted finally. She regarded him quietly, her ice-blue eyes scanning for truth, yet there was no judgment in them, only interest. The subtle admission shifted the dynamic between them. Observation became participation, watching became engagement, and the line between curiosity and genuine connection began to blur. Humor continued to play its role as a bridge. During a routine diagnostic of the ship's propulsion matrix, he accidentally activated a low-level magnetic pulse that sent several floating tools into chaotic orbits. She appeared in a blink, effortlessly redirecting the tools with a controlled gesture, then quipped, "Human ingenuity strikes again. Have you considered using less enthusiasm next time?" He laughed so hard that he nearly tipped himself into a coolant pipe, and she laughed with him, the sound like wind through fine metal chimes. One evening, while floating together in the observation deck, they shared stories of their respective homeworlds. He spoke of terrestrial oddities, forests, oceans, the simple absurdity of gravity and weather. She described the Lysari homeworld, forests of luminescent flora, rivers of shifting magnetic energy, and the subtle art of perceiving patterns invisible to most species. He joked about the improbability of humans surviving such an environment, and she countered with laughter that made the deck seem warmer, less sterile. They began to notice the subtle ways they influenced each other. She softened her teasing when he grew flustered. He allowed himself to linger in moments of shared humor instead of retreating into protocol. By the end of the chapter, their relationship had evolved into a complex orbit of observation, participation, and tentative trust. He found that he no longer feared being noticed. In fact, he sought it, craved it, even when it came wrapped in amusement or gentle critique. She, in turn, revealed more of herself through teasing, challenges, and quiet questions that demanded sincere answers. Their interactions, once simple exchanges, had grown into a dialogue rich with subtlety, humor, and the beginnings of something neither of them fully understood, but both felt deeply. As the artificial sun set over the orbital station, casting long, diffused rays through the greenhouse, they floated side by side, laughing over a shared mishap involving a zero-G watering tool. He looked at her long ears, the elegant curve of her features, the sparkle in her ice-blue eyes, and realized that the game of observation had become something entirely different. It was no longer about watching, or even about being watched. It was about noticing, about connection, about the quiet joy of shared absurdity in the vast, unfeeling expanse of space. And as she turned to him with that faint, enigmatic smile, he knew the orbit they shared was only beginning, and that the gravity between them, though subtle, was utterly irresistible. The hum of the ship's core resonated through every corridor as the human floated toward the greenhouse, a sense of anticipation settling in his chest that felt far heavier than the weightless environment around him. The Lysari woman was already there, kneeling slightly in zero-G to tend to a cluster of suspended flora that shimmered faintly with bioluminescent energy. Her silver-blonde hair framed her pale, luminous face, and her long ears angled with the smallest twitch, signaling awareness, curiosity, and perhaps amusement. He had spent countless hours observing her, laughing at her subtle jokes, dodging floating tools under her teasing guidance, and yet he realized that no amount of observation could fully capture the way she occupied the space, or the way she had quietly occupied his thoughts. "Morning," he said, voice careful not to startle her. She looked up, blue eyes glinting with that same calm intelligence he had come to both dread and crave, and tilted her head. "Morning, human, or is it still night in your perception?" she asked, lips curving in a faint smile. He chuckled, trying to ease the tension he felt coiling in his chest. "Time is relative, yes, but my perception of you is always present." She let out a soft laugh, the kind that seemed to suspend the ambient hum of the ship, and shook her head slightly, as if amused by both him and the absurdity of human verbal expression. Their latest assignment had been an anomaly in the ship's navigational arrays, a minor but persistent flux in quantum readings that defied easy explanation. As they moved toward the control hub, floating in zero-G with casual familiarity, she jabbed lightly at his floating wrist console with a finger tipped in soft luminescence. "You are slower than expected," she teased. "Are you observing the corridor walls for patterns or merely delaying?" He grinned, letting his shoulders relax. "A little of both. Patterns are important, yes, but sometimes the corridor walls make excellent conversational partners." She rolled her eyes, though the corners of her mouth betrayed amusement, and he realized that he no longer felt the sting of embarrassment in her teasing. It had become a shared rhythm, a language of its own. In the control hub, the anomaly proved trickier than anticipated. Nanoscale particles had begun to cluster unpredictably around the station's docking field, creating fluctuating electromagnetic interference that threatened minor equipment malfunctions. They worked together, exchanging quips and playful critiques as they adjusted magnetic dampeners, realigned sensor arrays, and calibrated feedback loops. At one point, a small cluster of particles leapt unexpectedly toward his wrist console, and she flicked a gentle pulse of energy, redirecting it with the ease of a maestro conducting invisible instruments. "I see," he said, grinning. "Humans may be clumsy, but we are persistent. Also, we attract quantum mischief." She laughed, the sound light and melodic, and replied, "Mischief suits you. Persistence does not hurt either." Hours passed in the precise rhythm of work interspersed with humor, observations, and the occasional slip of zero-G balance that elicited soft laughter from both of them. Then came the moment neither had anticipated. As he adjusted a calibration field, she floated closer than usual, brushing her shoulder against his, a contact so subtle it could have been accidental, but he felt it resonate through him like the faint pulse of the ship's core. Her eyes caught his, blue and unfathomable, and for a heartbeat, the anomaly faded from their minds, leaving only the awareness of each other. "Do you always notice everything?" she asked, her voice softer now, almost contemplative, almost intimate. He paused, fumbling with words, before answering with an honesty he had not voiced before. "No, not everything. Only the things that matter." She studied him silently, head tilted, hair brushing her ears with elegant precision. "And what matters," she said, a faint smile playing on her lips, "is often what you do not expect it to be." He chuckled, feeling warmth creep into his tone despite the chill of the recycled air around them. "Then I suppose I have been both observing and being observed, learning that the things that matter are not always quantifiable." She nodded, the briefest nod that conveyed agreement, recognition, and something deeper he could not yet name. As the artificial sun began its orbit across the observation dome, casting elongated, shifting beams of turquoise light into the greenhouse, they drifted side by side among the hydroponic flora. He found himself laughing at a minor mishap. A floating nutrient reservoir had spun toward his face, and she had flicked it with perfect timing to land harmlessly in its cradle. But the laughter carried a new weight, a shared understanding that stretched beyond humor. She tilted her head, studying him with that piercing gaze that had once intimidated him into self-consciousness, and said, "Humans have an amusing way of turning chaos into entertainment." He responded, floating slightly closer, "Perhaps. Or perhaps the universe has a way of teaching patience, perspective, and unexpected connection." They spent the next cycle recalibrating the sensors on the ship's exterior, navigating the labyrinth of docking arrays while exchanging playful critiques. At one point, a minor miscalculation caused a cluster of magnetic conduits to spin wildly. He spun in midair to intercept them, and she mirrored his motion, both of them colliding gently, laughter erupting mid-trajectory as their coordinated chaos unfolded. "You are predictably clumsy, yet oddly graceful when panicking," she commented. "And you," he replied, catching a floating conduit, "have a talent for making human error feel like art." She laughed again, and for a brief moment, the vast expanse of space outside the reinforced glass seemed irrelevant. The orbit they shared was everything. Later, in the observation deck, they rested against the transparent walls, watching the gas giant rotate lazily below them. He spoke of human traditions, absurd superstitions, and the strange rituals of storytelling that marked the passing of days. She spoke of Lysari memory practices, of perceiving patterns in electromagnetic pulses and subtle energy fields, of the art of quiet observation as a way to truly understand another being. He realized that what he had learned was not merely technical skill or observational acumen. It was connection, empathy, the ability to notice what mattered without being intrusive, to participate fully without losing oneself. "Do you ever tire of observing?" she asked suddenly, long ears twitching slightly. He thought for a moment, then smiled. "Perhaps, but I do not tire of noticing, of understanding, of learning. And sometimes, noticing leads to moments like this." He gestured vaguely at the shared expanse, the floating flora, and the soft shimmer of light that seemed to encapsulate them both. She regarded him quietly, expression softened, and reached out a single, slender hand, brushing against his. The contact was gentle, tentative, yet it carried an unspoken acknowledgement of trust, of curiosity fulfilled, of the emotional orbit they had carefully cultivated. The final moments of their shared cycle were spent in quiet collaboration, interspersed with jokes about the improbability of humans and Lysari coexisting in zero-G, laughter echoing faintly through the modules, the subtle warmth of shared understanding wrapping around them like a cocoon. He realized he had changed. The nervous fumbling, the panicked dodging of floating tools, the awkward humor, all had become threads in a tapestry of confidence, empathy, and subtle joy. She, too, revealed more of herself in laughter, teasing, and shared insight. Their interactions now a delicate balance of playfulness and sincerity, observation and participation. As the ship orbited the turquoise gas giant, the artificial sun casting its final rays across the greenhouse and observation decks, they floated side by side, hands brushing, laughter lingering in the recycled air. He looked at her long ears, the curve of her features, the shimmer of her pale skin in the soft light, and realized that the journey had not been about watching or being watched. It had been about noticing, understanding, and connecting. "I suppose," he said finally, voice soft but steady, "that what matters is what we choose to observe and how we respond to it." She turned to him, eyes catching the fading light, lips curling in a faint, enigmatic smile. "And sometimes," she replied, "the things that matter are the ones we discover together." They floated in silence for a moment, the ship humming around them, the stars outside distant and indifferent. And yet in that orbit of shared space and shared understanding, nothing else mattered. He had learned patience, humor, and the courage to engage without retreat. She had shown him the subtlety of trust, the art of quiet observation, and the joy of unexpected connection. And as they drifted together, laughter mingling with the hum of the Eos Horizon asterisk, the story that had begun with watching and curiosity concluded with understanding,